Hey guys, we're going to be going over the aggregate supply and demand. Not the whole packet because we've done a lot of it in class going over it, but it's the one that has the 12 boxes on the front. And then on the inside of that, it's got, remember this, it's got a whole bunch of changes of aggregate supply where you have to shift it left or right. And then on the second page, it looks something like this. It's got lesson 6, activity 27 there right at the top. And it starts with question number 8. We're actually going to omit that question. It's too easy. It's just like looking at aggregate supply and just, left or right. Let's do something a little bit more complicated. So part C. It says manipulating the aggregate supply and demand model. Okay, so this worksheet, number 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13 is just asking, the directions are just saying, just do aggregate supply and demand. Well, we know more, so we can do more. So let's challenge ourselves a little bit more than that. You can see here on the right here up on the screen, I have kind of divided it to aggregate supply and demand changes on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, Phillips curve changes. So you see that I've completely just drawn a line separating all the questions into two sides, and what it's going to look like on aggregate supply and demand, we're over here, and then what it's going to look like on the Phillips curve on the other side of the screen. So on question number 1, it starts off with, during a long, slow recovery from a recession, consumers postponed major purchases. Suddenly, they began to buy cars, refrigerators, televisions, furnaces to replace their failing models. So they're in some sort of recession, and then they start, people suddenly start to buy things again. Maybe their consumer confidence has gotten a little boost in some way. And so notice how we're starting from a recession. So your, aggregate supply and demand graph is not going to start off in equilibrium. It's going to start off with a recessionary gap. So let's draw it that way. So we have price level on the y-axis, 0 at the origin, real GDP on the x-axis. Aggregate demand sloped downwards, labeled AD1. Short run aggregate supply sloped upwards, labeled SRAS1 for short run aggregate supply. And we're going to have our equilibriums, boop, 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 1. Equilibrium's this way, boop, 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 1. And we're going to put LRAS not in long run equilibrium because the question says we're starting off slow from a recovery from a recession. So we're in a recessionary gap. So we're going to start off with long run equilibrium or long run aggregate supply to the right of our current equilibrium. So we are not meeting our potential. Here's LRAS. We have an output gap. We are producing inside of our PPF curve because we have, high unemployment during that recession. And it now says suddenly they begin to buy cars, refrigerators, televisions. So that's people spending more money. It's going to be a rightward shift of aggregate demand. Ugh. It doesn't really matter how far you shift aggregate demand to the right. Just know that if the question says, what's going to happen in the long run, you need to make sure that you are shifting it all the way to the long run. So where there's no recessionary gap anymore, but you're not shifting too far to now there's like an inflationary gap. You're going to shift it to where LRAS, SRAS, and then our new aggregate demand curve are all going to intersect in the same point. Well, if aggregate demand shifted to the right, we know that is going to create a movement on our Phillips curve. Remember, we have inflation on the y-axis, unemployment on the x-axis, and we're not starting in equilibrium. Just like with aggregate supply and demand, LRPC and SRPC, we are not starting in equilibrium. RPC. We're not starting here. We would like to be there. We're starting in a recession. Remember, a recession is somewhere over here with high unemployment and low prices. Inflation is pretty low. It's the unemployment that's a problem. And since we just shifted aggregate demand to the right, it's going to be a movement on our short run Phillips curve, and we're going to shift it, move up the line, up the short run Phillips curve until equilibrium. So just you can do A, B, or you can do some sort of arrows or ones and twos, just so you know that there's a change. If you just put points on the graph without actually having any direction, I don't know really where you're going and where you're coming from. Okay, question number 10. With no other dramatic changes, the government raises taxes, reduces transfer payments. So remember, transfer payments is like Social Security, welfare, unemployment benefits, stuff like that. So they're reducing payments to people, but they're also raising taxes. So not only are they giving people less money to spend, they're raising taxes on the money that they actually have, which means people have less money to spend and spending is going to go down. Consumption is going to go down. So on aggregate supply and demand, okay, it doesn't say anything about being in a recession or being in a period of high inflation. So we're going to just assume that it's in long run equilibrium with price level on the Y, real GDP on the X, aggregate demand slope downwards, AD, SRAS, and we're going to say that LRAS is in long run equilibrium because it doesn't say otherwise. LRAS. Don't forget your equilibriums, ... ones and ones. And they're raising our taxes. We have less disposable income. We're going to be spending less. Aggregate demand is going to shift to the left, causing a recessionary gap. Maybe that was our situation, number one. Maybe that's what happened to cause us to be in a recession in the first question. So both price level and real GDP will fall, and it'll be a movement on our Phillips curve. So remember, when aggregate demand shifts, it's going to create a movement on our short run Phillips curve. We have inflation and unemployment on our axes, short run and long run, short run Phillips curve, long run Phillips curve. Since we started in long run equilibrium, we can just start at our equilibrium for the Phillips curve. So we're right there, and we are not having so much spending. Aggregate demand was falling, and it's going to create a recession, which means there's going to be higher unemployment and lower prices. And so we can, I did my ones and twos, but you can also, just to clarify, ones and twos or A's and B's or some sort of arrow. All right, let's flip to the back of the page. All right, on the back of the page, number 11, we have a new scenario. News of possible future layoff frightens the public into reducing spending and increasing savings for the feared rainy day. So this sounds kind of familiar, the scenario. It doesn't say anything of us being in inflation or some sort of recession. So we're starting in long run equilibrium. To save time, I'm just going to write Y for output instead of real GDP. You can do either. We have aggregate demand. We have short run aggregate supply. We have long run equilibrium. One, boop, 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 boop. One, LRAS. Okay, so if our people are frightened, it seems like their confidence is a little shaky, they're reducing spending, that's going to be a decrease in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is going to shift to the left, causing a new equilibrium between AD2 and the original supply curve, short run supply curve, where prices have fallen, and it looks like output has fallen, GDP has fallen as well. And just like before, a shift of aggregate demand to the left causes a movement. So we have inflation, unemployment. It's just a movement from equilibrium to some sort of recession, which is further down on the short run Phillips curve to point B. So number 12 says, because of rising tensions in many developing countries, firms began to build new factories in Ecoland and to purchase sophisticated machinery from Ecoland businesses that will enable them to produce in Ecoland at prices that are competitive. Basically, it is a lot of words for just saying that there's new factories and they're producing more. New machinery, new factories, and they can produce more. So on our aggregate supply and demand graph, that is going to affect short-run aggregate supply. And if they have new factories and then aggregate supply, I just said aggregate supply and then I wrote aggregate supply. on my aggregate demand curve. Make sure you don't do that. It's best not to graph and talk at the same time, but alas. So it doesn't say anything about us being in a recession or a time of high inflation. So we're going to be in long run equilibrium with aggregate supply and demand intersecting on LRAS. And if there is new sophisticated machinery and new factories, then short run aggregate supply is going to increase and shift to the right, causing a new equilibrium between SRAS2 and our original demand curve with lower prices and higher output. Low prices go down, and GDP increases. Well, remember the Phillips curve, the short run Phillips curve and the short run aggregate supply are indirectly related. If there is a rightward shift of aggregate supply, meaning there's more aggregate supply, the Phillips curve is going to decrease, like shift to the left and decrease, because a rightward shift of aggregate supply is the best type of shift, and inflation and unemployment are both bad things. So there's less of both those bad things during a rightward shift of aggregate supply. So the Phillips curve is going to look something like this, with inflation, unemployment. We have the short run Phillips curve, SRPC, long run Phillips curve, LRPC, equilibriums. And since short run aggregate supply increased, the Phillips curve is going to shift in the opposite direction. It's going to shift to the left. Short run Phillips curve 2. And you could just leave it like that. You could put it in equilibrium and you can just do that. Okay, and the last one. Brazil solves its foreign debt and inflation problems, then orders $10 billion worth of capital machinery from Ecoland. Draw an aggregate supply and demand graph for Ecoland. Okay, so don't get confused between like Brazil and Ecoland. Brazil has problems or something and they're solving it, but then they buy a whole bunch of machinery from Ecoland. So you could look at this as two different things. If Brazil buys capital machinery from Ecoland, Brazil is importing this from Ecoland. And so that's going to affect the imports and therefore net exports. And Ecoland is going to be selling all this stuff to Brazil, which means the XN of Ecoland is going to increase, increasing aggregate demand, increasing GDP. Or you can also look at this as well. If Brazil is buying capital machinery from Ecoland, then Ecoland has less capital machinery, and it's going to affect how much stuff Ecoland can produce. So it's just a matter of both these things are happening. So let's do both of them. Okay, so let's have aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Remember, we're talking about Ecoland. We're not graphing Brazil. So we have price level, real GDP, aggregate supply. Oh my goodness gracious. That is the second time I've done that. That is not good. You know when you need to go home when you are labeling aggregate demand incorrectly. SRAS and then LRAS. LRAS. Okay, so let's look at the first idea. If Brazil is ordering capital machinery from Ecoland, they're buying it from Ecoland. Net exports are going to increase, which means aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. There's more aggregate demand because there's more goods that they are exporting to Brazil, causing higher prices and higher GDP. But then, here, let me change colors here. See if I can change colors to like a green. There we go. Okay, go away. All right, so now let's look at it from a different perspective, is that now because Ecoland just sold a whole bunch of machinery to Brazil, they have less machines. So not only did they get the money, they got money, but they had to give those machinery, the capital machines, to Brazil. And so they can produce less. So short and aggregate supply shifts to the left. And it really doesn't matter like how far you shift it. I'm going to just shift it a little further than equilibrium just for no reason, because I can't honestly see what I'm drawing with my slate here. So SRAS2. And now we have a new equilibrium between our new aggregate demand curve and our new short run aggregate supply. Okay, this is going to be one of those multiple choice questions that are kind of difficult when there's two types of shifts. Because if you look at our first aggregate demand shift, the price went up and GDP went up. But if you look at our short and aggregate supply curve, yes, price went up again, but this time GDP went back down. And it just depends on how much of a shift it really is. I know that for sure price level is totally going to go up, but when it comes to real GDP, this is one of those indeterminate questions. I don't really know what's going to happen in GDP. So this is what our aggregate supply and demand graph looks like. So what is our Phillips curve going to look like if we're having two types of shifts? Okay, so we have inflation. I'm going to spell it out because it's our last one. And unemployment. There's no room. And I'm going to have short run Phillips curve and long run Phillips curve. Boop, 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 boop. Long run Phillips curve. If you remember, we increase aggregate demand because if Brazil is buying all this capital machinery, they're buying it from Ecoland. That's more buying for Ecoland. And so that's going to be an upwards movement because it was a rightward shift of aggregate demand. So it's going from point, let's say 1 to point 2. But since they took that machinery, Brazil did, from Ecoland, they can't produce as much. And they are producing less. Short run aggregate supply decrease, which means our Phillips curve is actually going to shift. Let me change color so I can see this better. There we go. To the right. Short run Phillips curve 2. And honestly, okay, here's the thing. My graph from before, I shifted it so far that it wasn't on LRAS. If I had shifted it short run aggregate supply just a little bit to where it actually intersected right here at long run, then this would have been so perfect. I could have just moved my little point and been here. But since I shifted short run aggregate supply so much, it would be like I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think if it would actually matter. I think it would just be like, you would be here, but would it be here or here? Would it be on the curve? I don't want to confuse, so let's just say that we are now here at point 3. I mean, it's higher prices anyway. It's not just like straight across. And there we go. Unemployment is back to equilibrium. So that was kind of confusing, but don't expect too many of those on our unit exam. Expect a lot of those on the AP exam, where there's going to be lots of different shifting happening, but we are, still at the beginning of the semester. So we have lots more time to practice and more time to think of lots of scenarios. So if you have any questions about aggregate supply, aggregate demand, Phillips curve and their interactions, or just anything that we've been talking about in class, you can leave a message on this video. You can leave a message on Google Classroom. You can send a message on Remind. You can find me on Twitter, or you can just talk to me in class like a person. Either way, hopefully you are prepared for